Hello, everybody. We're back with another episode of Goddess Bible Study. Edward Dodge here. Lostgoddess.io is the website where you can catch the Substack and the write-ups and all the information about what we're doing. It's on the website, lostgoddess.io. Please like and subscribe and all that jazz. We've got Lisa Adams, our resident priestess, is in the house with us. We got the apostate father, Joshua, apostate priest, and we've got the Gnostic bishop, Nathan Wilson in the house. So say hi, everybody. Thank you for showing up.
Thanks for having us.
All right. So, any comments before we jump in, or we get right into the Assyrians here? All right. So this week we are talking about the mighty Assyrian Empire, which was quite a formidable animal in its day. Kind of reminds me of not one we talk a lot about in our view of the ancient world. We always talk about the Greeks and Romans. We don't talk as much about the Assyrians, but they sort of set the tone for the Romans that came later. But they were particular stylings of their own, which we'll get into here. So in this episode of Goddess Bible Study, we dig into the brutal and theologically fascinating history of the Assyrian Empire, the dominant military force of the early Iron Age. The Assyrians destroyed the nation of Israel in 722 BCE and sent 10 of the 12 tribes into exile, never to be heard from again. So for 3 centuries, from 912 to 612 BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was the most powerful the world had yet seen, and sophisticated in its own way. The Assyrians exercised a highly political theology, where their god Ashur was the greatest power in the cosmos, and ordained them to rule as his servants, ordained the Assyrian people and their kings to rule as his servants. Brutality was the will of the gods, divine punishment for the failure to submit. So the Assyrians built a model of leadership and bureaucracy that later empires would study and imitate. They were the first to mass-produce iron weapons, was the beginning of the Iron Age, superior in every way to the bronze arms of their rivals. Their army was disciplined and professional, their tactics advanced, and their siege engines were the pride of the empire. Purpose-built machines engineered to breach even the mightiest walled cities. So a siege engine are like what you see here in this AI picture, these tall embattlement things. You see them in the Lord of the Rings, and they can breach tall walls, and you can launch, battering rams and carried by orcs and all that stuff. Anyway, the Assyrians really.
Question.
Yeah.
I have a question. I'm wondering, since the Assyrian god was Ashur, if Asherah was involved, or if that was like
So
their
I did not write this
the
up. The consort of Ashur. And Ashur is basically another Mesopotamian storm god. He's very similar to Marduk. He's very similar, same vein as all these other warrior storm gods. So Zeus, Yahweh, Marduk. Ashur is just another one of these same guys. He has a goddess consort. I forget her name. And then also Ishtar is like Nineveh. The city of Nineveh is Ishtar's city. So sometimes Ishtar is conflated with this other goddess that's Ashur's consort, sometimes not. Sometimes Ishtar's his daughter, sometimes Ishtar's his wife. But they have another goddess that was their mother goddess, with another name that I didn't write down.
Okay. Yeah.
Sharua.
I just thought the names are so similar that there might be a connection.
I think it just goes with Assyria. Ashur, and the town is named Ashur. Assur. So I think he was just the northern version of Marduk. And because they take the Enuma Elish as their own birth story and just change the names of Marduk to
okay. That makes sense. Thank you.
Like it's totally the same culture, same religion.
Sharua was her name, I believe.
Yeah, I did research that, but the article was getting long enough as it was. I didn't want to get into the weeds. So the Assyrians earned a reputation for extraordinary cruelty and was a deliberate, well-documented policy. The palace reliefs at Nineveh, Nimrod, and Khorsabad depict flaying captives alive, impaling rebels on stakes, and stacking severed heads into pyramids outside conquered cities, all carved in intricate detail as boasts, not as incidental battle scenes. Amputating limbs and gouging out eyes, then leaving victims alive to wander as walking warnings, was a calculated strategy to instill fear and ensure submission. not cruelty for its own sake. Assyrian kings framed these campaigns of terror as carrying out the will of Ashur. The king executed divine judgment on rebels who, in Assyrian ideology, had broken their sworn oath to the god. I kind of wish I'd written this a little bit better, but yeah, the idea is that they had taken cruelty as something like it's the will of the gods and they're just being ordered to do it. And it's like, I like you, Charlie, but sorry, I got a flare skin. It's not my fault. The gods were ordering it. And so if you'd merely submitted to us, we wouldn't, be doing all this horrible, ghastly things. And so for them in their religious worldview, all of this systematic butchery was totally divinely inspired and divinely ordained. And because Ashur had ordained them, like their covenant with their God was that you have to rule as our servants. Like the kings literally call themselves the servants of Ashur. They don't call themselves kings or anything. They call themselves servants. And so they're just executing the will of the gods to, torture all these people and terrify them. And that's the idea, is like using systematic terror as a way to, break people's will to resist. And it probably worked, to a certain extent, or at least for a while. And then they also did deportations, which we'll talk about, which were also very systematic. So Assyria's reach extended across the major trade routes of the ancient world, dominating Babylonia, Western Persia, Anatolia, and the Levant, with its territory eventually stretching as far as Egypt. Israel and Judah, sitting astride vital trade corridors, played an outsized role in this imperial story, and the Assyrians appear throughout the biblical record as a result. This is one of the best documented periods in the ancient Near East. Historians and archaeologists have corroborated the biblical account against the records of Israel's neighbors, so we can read these conflicts from both sides. Assyria's achievements were not limited to war and theology. Building on medical foundations laid by Babylon and absorbing the knowledge and talent of every people it conquered, Assyria made real progress in medical science. Ashurbanipal II, from 884 to 859 BC, who consolidated Assyrian rule across the Levant and Canaan, went so far as to compile the first systematic list of plants and animals in the empire, bringing scribes along on his campaign specifically to record new discoveries. Assyrian expansion along the Mediterranean coast began in earnest under Shalmaneser III from 859 to 824, who extracted tribute from the wealthy Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon during the years that Ahab and Jezebel ruled Israel. Assyrian records confirm that Ahab's successor, King Jehu, submitted to Shalmaneser III and paid him tribute. So we showed the black obelisk of Shalmaneser in the last episode, where we have evidence of the Israelite king paying tribute. So this is my cheesy AI map that I did. It's kind of good, kind of not. And so it's obviously got all these flaws in it if you really look closely. But it kind of gives you the idea of how broad the Assyrian Empire. We're talking, the Assyrians are coming out of, they occupy like 3 cities. Nineveh is one of the main ones. That is its capital at certain times. That's the northern part of Mesopotamia, while Babylon was in the south, and they're kind of rivals. And then they were able to dominate all of Syria, up into Turkey, and then down through Israel, Judah, Lebanon, Jordan, all that, down towards Egypt. And we'll talk about the deportations in a second. Yeah, it's a silly map. Assyrian religion, so this is Ashur, the supreme god. Assyrian religion offers a striking parallel to the religious transformation underway in Israel and Judah. The Assyrians practiced a form of monolatry that approached and clearly influenced later monotheism. They insisted their god Ashur was the supreme power in the universe, but they didn't ban the worship of other gods outright. They simply recast every other foreign deity as another manifestation of Ashur himself. Kind of like the Hindus, one divine with many names and many manifestations, but Ashur is the godhead, make no mistake about it. So this was a shrewd political theology, allowing the empire to maintain religious and political consistency across its territory while avoiding the destructive conflict that comes with forcibly suppressing local temples. Assyrian military dominance was treated as self-evident proof of Ashur's supremacy, and the imperial propaganda machine made sure everyone knew it. The Assyrians believed Ashur had chosen them as his people and granted them the divine right to rule over the other nations, a belief that directly shaped Assyrian identity, ideology, and military expansion. Theology and empire grew in lockstep, and the theology was actively rewritten to justify political dominance. The empire wanted Ashur acknowledged as supreme. Not other gods, not other gods erased, so monolatry was a political project first. Tellingly, Ashur's cult disappeared entirely once Assyria collapsed. The god had no independent life apart from the imperial project that created him. His theology was so thoroughly a political instrument that it had no staying power once the political structure it served was gone. Assyrian religion was part of a broader current running through the ancient world in this era, the Axial Age, which pushed cultures towards higher, more transcendent conceptions of the divine. Hebrew monotheism, Zoroastrianism, Chinese Taoism, Confucianism, and strands of Greek philosophy all emerged from the same current, each rejecting the older, more immanent understanding of the divine found in nature worship and shamanism. This shift had consequences that fell disproportionately on women. As we've been talking about, the goddesses lose their rank in these systems. So Assyria was a deeply patriarchal culture. The Hebrews and the Greeks are not the only ones going to patriarchy. Everybody is going to patriarchy in this time period, and the Assyrians are leading the way even. So women's legal and property rights were severely curtailed compared to older Mesopotamian cultures, and their sexuality was tightly controlled by their families. In comparison to older Babylon, Sumerian cultures where where it was matriarchal and women all this sexual freedom, not in the Iron Age. All that that game is all over, and so the Assyrians arrived there first, ahead of even the Greeks and the Hebrews.
It does seem, and as I was reading this, I was like, this seems like they definitely laid out sort of the foundations for so much of what's happening now. Um, Both like the imperialistic sort of ideas of, that they deserve to rule, and like hold land, that sort of thing, but also this idea of the chosen people, which, if it comes when it comes right down to the chosen people concept, like that's actually very narcissistic.
Yeah, right.
And,
Totally.
and then you see how it turns into a whole identity and, becomes more imperialistic. And I think that's probably part of why that shows up in, sort of the really cruel, sort of violent ways that they, I guess, like, threaten their enemies, or were like, "This is, we're gonna flay you open. We're gonna, collect your skulls and put them on spikes like Vlad the Impaler."
I know, right?
Didn't exist at that time. But, it just, and I mean, at the same time, it is brilliant that they really took that polytheistic view to help the people that they conquered to assimilate more easily into their culture by allowing them to sort of keep their gods, but with this understanding it's all the same God, right? Anyway, it just seems like they really sort of um got the ball rolling in a certain direction, didn't they?
Yeah, they really do. They really kick off what we see throughout the rest of the Iron Age, um, in terms of empire and political theologies and harsh patriarchy. They really it all flows from here, it seems like. So this is a picture I made also with AI. They have these original reliefs are in the British Museum, but they're all crumbly and stuff, so they're kind of hard to read if I just take the photos. I've been using AI. I was doing this last episode to recreate some of these images just to at least give the style. So this isn't even meant to be a specific relief. This is just sort of in the style of what they're doing. So in the top and the back, you see on the right the siege engines. I don't know if you can see them here or my mouse. My mouse doesn't show up, but the top right, you've got the siege engines and they're sacking a city. Then down below that, on the middle right, a bunch of captives, a bunch of soldiers. Then on the left there, and in who's big is that's the king. Whichever king it is, generic Syrian king, overlooking his captives. Then at the bottom, you've got scribes and a guy tied to a pole who's going to be flayed or whatever, and then you've got heads on spikes. The AI actually won't let you really do super gory stuff. It starts to run into its censorship. If you say do it really gory, it won't do it. Um, but yeah, this is the art style of the Assyrians. It's a classic Mesopotamian style, and these carved. I don't know if they're sandstone or what they're carved into, But these reliefs are really huge and elaborate, as we will see. We've got some more down below. Comments? All right, so Syria had fallen into civil war before Tiglath-Pileser III, Tiglath-Pileser III, from 745 to 727 BC, seized power and revitalized the empire. Many scholars regard his reign as a true beginning of the Neo-Assyrian Empire proper. He reorganized the military into what became the most effective fighting force history had yet produced. In 729, he marched into Babylonia and captured the king of Babylon himself. Tiglath-Pileser appears directly in the biblical text as the conqueror who brought Israel to heel and demanded heavy tribute from Samaria. In the time of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, this is 2 Kings 15, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and took Ijon, Abel-Beth, Makkah, Genoa, Kadesh, and Hazor. He took Gilead and Galilee, including all the land of Naphtali, and deported the people into Assyria. So we'll have a bunch of references now in the Bible of these various Assyrian kings because they get tightly wrapped with what happens. So in Judah, all right, so this guy's important. King Ahaz and the altar of Ashur. So this is an important bit in the Bible story here. So in Judah, King Ahaz became a vassal of Tiglath-Pileser, paying tribute and allying himself with Assyria against Israel and Syria. Relations between Judah and Israel went back and forth over the years, but at this point they're hostile. So Ahaz was thoroughly pagan in his practice, embracing Assyrian religion wholesale. He even built an altar to Ashur and installed it inside the temple of Yahweh itself, an act that scandalized the biblical writers. Ahaz went further still, sacrificing his own children, placing him among the most offensive kings in the biblical record, second only to Ahab and Jezebel in the eyes of the Deuteronomistic historians. So this is 2 Kings 16. Ahaz followed the ways of the kings of Israel and even sacrificed his son in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations Yahweh had driven out before the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and burned incense at the high places, on the hilltops and under every spreading tree. Ahaz's submission to Assyria was total and self-interested. Facing pressure from Aram and Israel, he turned to Tiglath-Pileser directly for rescue, stripping the treasuries of both the temple and the royal palace to pay for it. So 2 Kings carries on here, 2 Kings 16. Ahaz sent messengers to say to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, I am your servant and vassal. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Aram and the king of Israel who are attacking me. And Ahaz took the silver and gold found in the temple of Yahweh and in the treasuries of the royal palace and sent it as a gift to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria complied by attacking Damascus and capturing it. He deported its inhabitants to Kir and put Rezin to death. So the altar itself has a remarkable origin story. Ahaz then travels to Damascus himself to meet Tiglath-Pileser in person, and while there, he saw an altar that impressed him enough to send detailed construction plans home ahead of him. So back to 2 Kings 16. Then King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. He saw an altar in Damascus and sent to Uriah the priest a sketch of the altar, which detailed plans for its construction. So Uriah the priest built an altar in accordance with all the plans that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus and finished it before King Ahaz returned. When the king came back from Damascus and saw the altar, he approached it and presented offerings on it. He offered up his burnt offering and grain offering, poured out his drink offering, and splashed the blood of his fellowship offerings against the altar. As for the bronze altar that stood before Yahweh, he brought it from the front of the temple, from between the new altar and the temple of Yahweh, and put it on the north side of the new altar. The image is hard to miss. The altar of Yahweh is physically shoved aside to make room for the altar modeled on the Assyrian religion, with the king of Judah himself performing the sacrifices. All right, so we can pause there. Any comments? So anyway, this is like after Ahab and Jezebel, this is the next really, really, really bad king in the Bible. King Ahaz is really bad. Nobody names their kids Ahaz. He's a bad dude. So he sacrifices his own kids. He sets up the all the pagan offerings in the temple of Yahweh. moves Yahweh's altar to put an altar to Ashur, presumably. Ashur is never named in the Bible. It's interesting because they do name some of these other gods, but Ashur's kind of like Anat. It's one of these gods you don't want to name because they were sort of too powerful. They kind of overshadow Yahweh. So they never name Ashur. They only mention these more minor gods among the neighbors. So, but yeah, Ahaz, lives out his life as this pagan king. He doesn't get whacked or anything. So,
But I mean, it's really only Yahweh is really the only one who even cares about, you know, burnt offerings and altars and sacrifices and everything. Um, and it makes sense. They're all still pagan back then. And even if you're conqueror or if you're a vassal to, a different empire, going along with paganism,
I
makes
mean, is it
sense
not
even
exactly
for
what's being
survival.
described of like Ashur just, says, your Yahweh is just a manifestation of me. So it makes perfect sense. You'd put the superior altar in the temple to Yahweh. You don't get rid of the altar to Yahweh. It's still there. It's just pushed aside. So I think they're just describing, the Bible is describing exactly the same thing that the scholars are describing.
I mean, it makes sense because a lot of times, just in practice, you would have altars at different places and you might have, different gods placed on them as part of your practice or your temple or your, like your ritual and everything. So
It's
plus
just
the
not
whole
problem with
idea.
polytheism. It's just not
I
a
mean,
problem.
right. It's polytheism. You're like, we need this god in the north for these properties, and we need this god over here because he brings these things in, and this goddess for that. So it all makes sense to me because this is what I practice. So they can all live in harmony or not. And so you kind of got to go through all the motions to make sure everybody's working together for the same purpose.
And Joshua, were you going to say something there? So, and then the Yahwehs do the exact thing that the Assyrians don't do, which is forcibly shut down the other temples, which creates all this hostility in the society. The Egyptians did the same thing for briefly with Aten. Prior, in like the 1300s BC, they tried to have this, monolatry of just religion of Aten. They tried to shut down all the other, the king Akhenaten tried to shut down all the other temples, and then those reforms only lasted 20 years. As soon as he died, they reopened all the temples again. Um, that's what happens to the Hebrews. Like nobody likes that having, people are willing to change, but like they don't want to have everything forced upon them.
Also notice with these Assyrians, they worship a mixture of Sumerian and even Canaanite gods, but yet they're attacking the same people that would arguably worship the same gods as them. You really see the whole notion of where this god's chosen people and these gods favor us more, and so we're subject under them and you're subject under us. You kind of see that even passed on in monotheism today as well, the whole subjecting other people under them. Kind of interesting.
Yep. So Tiglath-Pileser III died in 727 and was succeeded by Shalmaneser V. King Hoshea of Israel, perhaps sensing weakness in the transition, stopped paying tribute and allied himself with Egypt against Assyria in 725 BC. It was a fatal miscalculation. Shalmaneser responded by invading Israel outright and laying siege to Samaria for 3 years. Hoshea himself was captured and imprisoned. So back to the Bible, 2 Kings 17. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hoshea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and had paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was a traitor, where he had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore, Shalmaneser seized him and put him in prison. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Halah, in Gozan on the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. So the fall of Samaria in 722 BC brought a permanent end to Israel as an independent kingdom. Its people were deported across the Assyrian Empire, scattered into history as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The Assyrians were not indiscriminate about resettlement. Deportees were allowed to bring their families and possessions and were settled on new land, while people from other conquered territories were moved in to replace them. Once a conquered population submitted to central authority, the Assyrians treated them as Assyrians. Resettlement served as a form of forced assimilation, and those who complied were treated relatively well, while resistance was met with slaughter. So this is a really important policy, like this, the way this whole resettlement thing worked and the effects it had on population groups. In America, we have migrations and we expect people to assimilate and become Americans. The Syrians are doing the same thing, except they're just doing it under threat of violence. But if you comply, like the people who have good lands are given other good lands, and the people who have wealth and privilege keep their wealth and privilege. And in fact, it's the people of wealth and privilege that they want to move. They want the more learned and skilled people to help rebuild these new towns in the Assyrian image. And if you get along, they'll treat you fine. So it's this flip side of it's like a hardcore carrot and stick policy, carrot and stick to the extreme. Take this land we're going to give you and some money, or we're going to flay you alive and cut your skin off. It's like kind of an easy bargain to take. And it's a really important thing of how the Assyrians did their business.
Part of that seems as though they also wanted to break up communities
Mhm.
so that like minds weren't always with other like minds, but
Exactly.
like sort of tear apart some of those relationships, right? So that it wasn't so tribal and that it would make it harder for them to sort of do like an uprising,
It's
right,
exactly what they're
against
doing.
them.
It's exactly what they're
Yeah.
doing. It's totally systematic. You break up these tribes. This is why the 10 tribes of Israel are lost. And this is why you can see how the matriarchal families, whatever had remained, get totally just swept away when an empire like this comes through. Whatever was left of indigenous people in the land, just whatever last vestiges of them are just totally swept away. And so the 10 lost tribes of Israel really are lost to history because they are truly intentionally scattered and the family bonds are broken. So then you go remarry people out of other broken tribes and you form new communities and life goes on. But it's with new identities and new names and a new citizenship as Assyrians. Um, and whatever your past was is just the old country, right?
It's powerful. I mean, it's erasure, right? It's powerful.
I mean, it really worked. I mean, they made a go of it for a few centuries.
The Jewish people as well, or tribes of Israel and Samaritans, also the Samaritans, they have an interesting history, either with each other, fighting against each other, and oftentimes falling together, I've noticed. So, but yet they don't really oftentimes like each other, the Samaritans and the Jews, even though they're a Jewish religion.
Yeah, I don't really understand that whole relationship entirely. Um, so the biblical writers naturally tell a different story about why Israel fell. For them, the cause was not Assyrian military superiority, but Israel's failure to worship Yahweh properly, even as the Assyrians themselves credited their victories to the superior power of Ashur. Biblical writers performed the ultimate theological judo when they successfully recast the destruction of Israel and later Judah by outside powers as Yahweh's punishment of Israelite polytheism rather than victories for the Assyrian Ashur or Babylonian Marduk. I just want to stop on that for a second. This thing that the biblical writers do after the exile, after that they're sent away from Jerusalem, to recast the destruction of Israel as Yahweh's doing, not as Ashur is doing, but as Yahweh's doing, as if Ashur had been following Yahweh's dictates to destroy Israel, is like the power of the narrative. To rewrite history and recast history and to erase, as you're saying, erase the other history so people don't know it, and recast history in your own theological or propagandistic lens. But I think this is one. I think it's really the effect on Jewish and Christian religious tradition that because I always when I grew up in church, I really remember hearing these stories as when the fall of Israel and the fall of Jerusalem is because the Israelites were bad, and it was Yahweh did deliver this punishment. Really, the way I was taught it. Um, and to come along later and learn about this much more powerful God who absolutely, from their perspective, from an Assyrian perspective, the idea that you would say Yahweh ordered Ashur around you would have been laughed out of the room. Like you never could have, that argument never would have been taken seriously in that time period. It's actually only the destruction of Ashur later on that even allows that argument to even get any traction at all.
I mean, they're always going to come back to that narrative of Yahweh being like a punishing God, like, and trying to crack down and be strict on the people for not doing as he says. And I mean, that continues and it continues. And that's their method of, I guess, like control, right? Is Yahweh is going to punish you. Your God, your God is going to punish you if you don't do the thing your God wants you to do, no matter what. But yeah, just that, like, we're going to take reality and we're going to flip it around and sell you a new reality. Um, I mean, that's happening writ
I mean, we see it
large
all the time throughout history. I mean,
now.
so many examples of effective propaganda.
Yeah,
This happens to be a really good one, though. Like the way you're calling monotheism is the original psyop. Like this is it. Like right, this is it in the flesh. They never
totally.
they never mentioned Marduk either, for that matter. And so Marduk was really the most powerful god. Marduk and Ashur. These are much older, much more entrenched, widespread gods than Yahweh ever was in this time period. And so the biblical writers mentioned like Chemosh and Milcom and some of these other minor gods, but they never mentioned Marduk, Ashur, Anak, the really big, super powerful ones, because they don't want anyone to remember. They want to erase that memory. Don't. It's the easiest way for no one to know about it is to not write the name down, and then it's not a part of the history books anymore.
Regarding
Fascinating.
punishment as well with Yahweh, we also have this with the Samaritans as well. The Jewish people didn't like that they worshipped Asherah alongside Yahweh as his wife, and then later on the Samaritans would drop Asherah, also taking on that approach that Yahweh was punishing them and also punishing the Jews, while the Jews believed Samaritans were being punished and they also were being punished. So this same belief of Yahweh punishing these groups of people and dropping this idea of worshipping other gods alongside this new tribal god, which was new on the scene, as you mentioned, pretty much, but compared to these other gods, much older.
So 2 Kings 17, all this took place because the Israelites had sinned against Yahweh their God. The Israelites secretly did things against Yahweh their God that was not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom Yahweh had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that aroused Yahweh's anger. The list of offenses reads like a checklist of everything the Yahweh's reform movement was working to stamp out: idols, golden calves, Asherah pole, worship of the starry host, worship of Baal, child sacrifice, and divination. So more 2 Kings 17. They forsook all the commands of Yahweh their God and made for themselves two idols cast in the shape of calves, the golden calves, and an Asherah pole. They bowed down to all the starry hosts, and they worshiped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination and sought omens and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of Yahweh, arousing his anger. So, in the aftermath, the king of Assyria repopulated the towns of Samaria with the people brought in from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, who took over the towns the Israelites had left behind. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. 2 Kings 17. So after Samaria, so this is the last stage, the Assyrians, Shalmaneser V died suddenly during the siege of Samaria and was succeeded by Sargon II, under whom the empire reached its greatest political and military heights. Sargon II was followed by Sennacherib, 705 to 681, who campaigned widely and ruthlessly, devastating Judah and laying siege to Jerusalem during the reign of King Hezekiah. Sennacherib made the ancient city of Nineveh his capital, building there the famed palace without rival, along with a vast library. Nineveh was dedicated to the goddess Ishtar, and many scholars now believe that Sennacherib's grand palace gardens in Nineveh were in fact the true Hanging Gardens of Babylon, since no trace of that famous wonder of the ancient world has ever been found in Babylon itself. In 701 BC, Sennacherib sieged the Judean city of Lachish. They don't know how to pronounce that. Lachish, a critical fortified city. The loss of Lachish was devastating to King Hezekiah, but the Bible gives the event only a brief mention. The victory was important enough to second Sennacherib that he commissioned an enormous carved relief detailing the battle in all its bloody glory for his palace in Nineveh. The relief covers the walls of a large room and measures 39 feet long and 16.7 feet high. It's absolutely huge, and currently resides in the British Museum. These contrasting accounts, biblical versus Assyrian, is one of the clearest examples of how the Book of Kings is total political propaganda. We'll explore this event more fully in the next episode on King Hezekiah. So let me just read this. 2 Kings 18. In the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked and captured all the fortified cities of Judah. So Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent word to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me, and I will pay whatever you demand from me. And the king of Assyria extracted from King Hezekiah of Judah 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. So we'll talk about this more next time. This is, again, an AI recreation, but so the temple, the reliefs of Lachish is this huge thing, like I said, 40 feet long, almost 17 feet high, that's in the British Museum. It's kind of busted up, but it has all this detail. It's all about this, the attacks on Judea, and it's like perfectly complements these Bible stories. But the Bible story is like one word, like one line, like he sieged Judah, and the king sent message at Lachish, and like doesn't say anything more. And it's not until like thousands of years later, the modern archaeologists got to work that they realized that Lachish was like this really important city, like the most fortified city outside of Jerusalem for Judah, and like this critical military encampment, and heavily fortified, big walls and all this stuff, and that the siege was a very serious endeavor by the Assyrians, which is why they commemorated it with this huge carved relief, because like it took them a while to get it done. And so there's all this detail of like the battering rams and the siege ramps, downed people, captives, all this stuff. So this is like don't let anyone tell you the Bible, there's nothing true in the Bible. Like the Book of Kings is total real history. It's just that it's like written like North Korean Politburo propaganda.
Also sexual in some ways too, with the moment of like aroused anger and submission. So it's like very submissive based. Even empires or kingdoms are described as feminine. So you see a very sexual rooted thing in these stories as well. A very submissive side of things.
Right. So the real thing says has a inscription: Sennacherib, king of the universe, king of Assyria, sits on a throne, and the spoils of Lachish are paraded before him. So that would be Sennacherib there on the right. Sennacherib's ambitions eventually turned toward Babylon, which he invaded, breaking its canals and flooding the city before looting its ancient temples. An act of sacrilege so extreme that even his own people considered it beyond the pale. Sennacherib was ultimately assassinated in his own palace by his sons, who saw his crimes against the old Babylonian gods as unforgivable. That is also mentioned in the Bible, but I didn't quote it. His successor was Esarhaddon, this whole thing where they invade Babylon. Babylon had these huge canals that went through it, and like under the city walls, there was two big rivers into the city. It's this really dramatic thing with bridges over it and stuff. And so, um, he flooded the city somehow and destroyed all the temples and went into the temple of Marduk and up on the. I guess he must have gone up on the. They got the ziggurat there, right? And with the temple of Marduk at the top, I think he went up on there and desecrated the ancient temples, which of course they would have seen as Ashur's, in benefit of Ashur. But I guess it really, um, his sons like killed him for it, like that it was so bad. It was such a scandal. So his successor was Esarhaddon, one of those very sons who secured the throne by killing all his brothers and rivals in a brief civil war. Esarhaddon went on to expand the empire into Egypt and secured vassal treaties across the region. The last great king of Assyria was Ashurbanipal, who reigned from 669 to 631 BC and is remembered above all for the extraordinary library he built in Nineveh, sending envoys to every corner of the empire to acquire texts for preservation in the royal library. Ashurbanipal is famed as a scholar king who spoke many languages and was highly literate. After Ashurbanipal's death, the empire began to unravel. It had grown too large to govern effectively, and its outlying regions began breaking away one by one. In 612 BC, a coalition of Babylonians, Persians, Medes, and Scythians sacked and burned Nineveh, massacring its residents. The destruction of Nineveh was complete and systematic. It seems that Assyria's enemies truly hated them. Ashur's cult center in Assur was plundered and the temples desecrated. Worship of Ashur disappeared along with the empire he championed. In Nineveh, the largest city in the world at the time, the brutal combat went house to house, and the temples to Ashur were completely razed to the ground. The king was killed, and a Neo-Assyrian king attempted to hold on in exile for a few more years before finally falling at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon at Carchemish in 605. We will also discuss this event in more detail later on. There's a strange grace in how the story closes. The fires that destroyed Nineveh baked its clay tablets hard and buried them beneath the rubble, preserving them for millennia. The catastrophe inadvertently produced one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history when the ruins were unearthed 2,454 years later in 1842 CE. The Royal Library of Ashurbanipal yielded a treasure trove, vast quantities of art, and some 30,000 cuneiform tablets, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, and also clear evidence of the ritual use of cannabis. So in the next episodes, we'll talk about Judah, Hezekiah, Josiah, more about the Assyrians. But yeah, so when when Nineveh was sacked and destroyed, this enormous library that Ashurbanipal had built was all baked in, and all this stuff was found 2,500 years later. And much of the best stuff we have from Mesopotamia comes out of this one find. Many more stories than just the ones I just mentioned there, but like the complete Enuma Elish, complete Epic of Gilgamesh, were all found here. I think even multiple copies. And so yeah, it's pretty wild. I think about the sacking of Nineveh a lot. Like I grew up in Washington D.C. and I imagine like this once grand city and how unimaginable it must have been for the residents who had lived there for generations and for centuries. This has been the most important city in the region, biggest, wealthiest, most grand, and to have all these enemies come in from barbarians of the gates come in and literally kill everybody. Like I think they were pretty merciless, is my understanding of how it went down. That everybody hated the Assyrians. That these centuries of cruelty and torture had, broken everybody's. Once the opportunity came, they had no sympathy for the Assyrians whatsoever. And the Scythians, being the Amazonian warrior women, at least I knew, like they're the Amazon tribes. They participated in this. The Medes and Persians are from Iran, and then the Babylonians would eventually emerge as the new power. Any thoughts on any of this, or should I take it off the screen? Leave it on this for a second. So next episode we'll return to Judah and we'll get the three great kings. The great reformer kings. Hezekiah is the great reformer king for Yahweh. And then he's replaced by Manasseh, who goes back to paganism and is the longest ruling king and one of the most successful in Judah. Then his grandson, I guess, is Josiah, who's the last great reformer king. He gets himself killed too. But there's really interesting stories about Hezekiah. These are real historical people. Hezekiah in particular is very interesting, and the whole siege of Jerusalem under Sennacherib is fascinating. And there's much more to the story.
I would just want to say that, that library of Ashurbanipal that find is, in my opinion, bigger than the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi finds, and we don't give it enough attention as we should, in my opinion, because we're so focused on the Bible stories rather than what those cuneiform texts actually can shed light on with regard to those Bible studies and where they're sourced from. So that's all. That's a lot of irony in there.
Yeah, I think it might be the biggest, or certainly one of the biggest finds. I mean, the Ugaritic text was a big one, but Nineveh was bigger.
Well, you have the story of like the Atrahasis, and you have these stories that up until what was that 18? What was the date that you gave when we uncovered all that? We thought that
1842. It's one of the first things they've.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's like the beginning of modern archaeology, like right around the mid 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
And so they start poking around in Babylon. Nineveh was one of the first places that they dug into, and they immediately struck gold. Those guys, that the mound was just covered with dirt, and it wasn't even that deep or anything. And they immediately got into these palaces. The palace has just been abandoned, and people lived right nearby, but because there's a town there in Nineveh today. People live there now. It's in modern day Iraq. And so it's not like they completely abandoned the whole region. They just abandoned the palace and stuff and moved, a mile away or something. And they just got covered in dirt, it's just covered in soil. And just nobody thought to go poking around, I guess, until the Europeans came along in the 19th century.
Yeah.
I did my due diligence and looked up Ashur's consort goddess or goddesses in this case. So one of them that was considered the most prominent is Melissu. And they don't really, of course, I'm using Google here. So Google's not giving a lot of information specifically about that goddess. But then, obviously there's some mention of Ishtar, but another female companion apparently was Serua.
Mm-hmm.
Serua.
Yeah, I have something about it here.
Yeah.
I did an AI search on it. Let me see. All right. So did Ashur have a consort goddess? This is what Claude told me. Mulissu, Mullissu. Is that was that the name you got? What's his primary consort? She's essentially a rebranded version of Ninlil, the Sumerian goddess who was wife to Enlil. So Enlil's the warrior storm god before. Mm-hmm. And so Ashur is just like another iteration on the same thing. And this parallel isn't a coincidence. Ashur himself was modeled on Enlil. So when the Assyrians built out Ashur's divine household, they simply imported Enlil's wife along with them and renamed her Mulissu. She was worshipped alongside Ashur in his own temple complex at the city of Astor. Was regarded as divine queen and mother figure and functioned in oracles as an intercessor who protected the king and city during wars and succession crises, a role she played for kings like Asarhaddon and Ashurbanipal specifically. But his family was inconsistent and inconsistent and politically constructed, not the product of organic myth. Assyrian sources genuinely disagree on whether the goddess Sarua, another goddess, was Ashur's wife, daughter, or sister. One king called her his daughter, while a later king called her his wife. A Neo-Assyrian text goes so far as to insist that should specifically be called his wife rather than daughter. Various forms of Ishtar, Ishtar of Nineveh, Ishtar of Arbala, were also sometimes cast as Ashur's wife and sometimes as his daughter, depending on the city and period. This inconsistency itself is the point. These familial relationships were fluid and politically motivated rather than reflecting a stable inherited mythology. The Syrians were essentially assembling a divine household for Ashur on the fly, borrowing wives, children, and titles from older, better established Mesopotamian gods like Enlil, Anu, Marduk, or Shamash, in order to dress up a former city god as a universal supreme deity, without inventing a whole new cosmology from scratch. Which is like very parallel to what we see happening with Yahweh. They do it in a different way, different take on it, but it's a very similar, very clear similarities. Well, we don't have to have this one be real long if this is not the most inspiring convo. That's okay. This one is pretty much straight history. We kind of got to get through some of this. Next week we'll be back into the reforms on really whacking the Asherah poles and all that stuff, and we'll probably take 2 weeks to go through the reforms of Hezekiah, Josiah, just so we can chew on the bone a little bit. But this is a good setup for that, and it's an interesting period of history. I think doesn't get a lot of attention. Certainly not something I ever heard about until I dug into it myself. The cruelty alone is, is interesting. So.
And I think there's a conversation here, not that we have to prolong, but the story that you regarding northern Israel and Judah and the consolidation of authority in this monotheistic religion that the Yahweh cult is trying to enforce upon Israel is very pronounced here. And I think there's an analog for this that even you can kind of even see the same kind of trend or consolidation that happened with in the churches themselves, which would come many years later in the Christian church, the same tendency to consolidate, whether you see it in the Roman Catholic Church, the separation from the Orthodox churches that could be compared to like northern Israel and all those other tribes, and then you have the consolidation of doctrine in Rome. And I'm sure you can see this in other cultures where there is this human tendency to want to consolidate, and that's probably a very the idea or the definition of what we're dealing with when it comes to patriarchy here. There's something about that tendency in these patriarchal cultures to consolidate this stuff. To your point of this whole Goddess Bible study, the more Israel and the northern kingdoms kind of connected to the folk religion, the more heretical they were, the more outside the orthodoxy they were, and they needed to be, banished or punished. Same thing.
Yeah, one God, one king, one
same thing with
priesthood, right? Centralized authority, centralized power, centralized command and control.
All about control. It's all about
and you
control.
see it over and over and over again. Like I mentioned, the Catholic Church is the Orthodox. You have the consolidation in the Pope. With the Orthodox, you have the quote unquote patriarchs, but they were all in like a community of hierarchs, so there was more collegiality there. But it's still patriarchal. But you can still see this consolidation factor going towards a very dominating position of authority. And the more that control factor is
this
there.
Is why we need the right of rebellion, because without the right of rebellion, these kings get out of control, and the only way to keep them in check. This is what the Eastern Orthodox, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Holy Roman, did, was absolute autocracy for the king, mitigated by absolute red rebellion. So whoever took the throne had absolute power, but anybody, he couldn't hold the power. And so we need to remember that as a people, like, the whole Protestant Reformation is a rebellion against bad leadership of the Pope and the bad leadership of the papal authorities who had abused their authority. And so the Protestants rebelled. And as a Protestant myself, I always thought it was a good thing. And, America exists because we rebelled against the British Empire, who were abusing their authority. And now we've got new authorities that are we can see it already, abusing their authority. And so human beings need to have the power to rebel. And if you give away your power to rebel, you're just asking for trouble. You're just asking to be taken advantage of.
Well, you see this, and it's like it's almost like when people don't feel safe. Like we're seeing this right now, where there's something of a revival towards people moving towards these, what we would call more patriarchal expressions of like Christianity. There's a revival in the Catholic Church, revival in the Orthodox. There's tons of people coming back to these. Why? Because it's more chaotic out here.
Yeah.
People are afraid, and they need to be controlled. They want to be told what to do, because to not be under that kind of authority, I guess, is scary. So
Well, we are living in a chaotic world, and it does make sense that are people returning to traditional norms where there's some sense of like, reliability and stability. And we should expect to see a revival of these older traditions. But these older traditions are themselves have so many fractures inside them that I don't know that just because people are going back to the Catholic Church, that necessarily you can sweep away all the sex scandals as well as they've done with selecting new popes that are far away from the scandal. The last two popes have been very well chosen politically, to divert attention away from the sex scandals.
yeah,
But that I don't think that I don't think those scandals have been put to rest. Is my sense of it all. And certainly the Protestant
Non-dogmatically,
churches,
the
which
writers
I'm
could.
more feel a little more equipped to speak about the Protestant churches, I think are have become kind of a joke, really. I mean, just like um, between the nutty Zionist evangelicals and the prosperity gospel charlatans, there's not a lot going on that in the Protestant world that I have a lot of faith in.
no, and it's only compounded now with more and more that we're seeing with the whole sex trafficking that's happened in Protestant missionary groups, and it seems to be unraveling right before our eyes. But because of that chaos, it's also causing this strange desire to go back into these consolidated forms and expressions of Christianity that actually likely caused the problem in the first place. If and so I
Yeah,
don't
it's a very
know what to
reactionary
do.
move, right?
Yeah.
So paganism's coming back as well, starting to be a bit more popular. Gnostic Christianity, even Unitarianism is starting to get a little bit more popular. Universalist Unitarianism, because they've moved away from dogmatic approach and they welcome everyone, all schools of thoughts, and that's getting quite popular, which is good to see. It's growing. It's not super popular compared to Catholicism or Orthodoxy. It's certainly not Catholicism because it's pumped all around the world, but they are growing. So other people are looking for alternative means of living. Spirituality on the rise, the need for searching for plant medicine or mystical experiences. So it's good to see. So there's always a yin and yang. There's always a opposite or another approach or an alternative approach. Someone's always going to be searching for. But I like to see more of that alternative approach rise because I think that's ultimately where we're somewhat heading, though slowly. I think that's the answer to things.
Think it is rising. I mean, I've seen a lot of growth in the time that I've been within these broader communities and regions. And you also have to remember that a lot of people are concerned about the fate of the earth and the environment. So that plays a part as well, because people are concerned and it like makes sense to have more reverence for, the living elements and the things that grow and the things that crawl or fly or, slither along the earth. Like it makes sense that we'd want to, you know, conserve and preserve all of that, but also that, those things have been around for, in many cases, longer than humans have. They have a lot to teach us. And that's also where we get everything we need, right? Like everything that we eat, our medicine, just our homes, like everything we have is given to us from nature. So that makes sense too, that figures in there. Whether you include gods or not, at least including that, nature worship and, that sort of more like animist approach too.
Well, I'm all for the ecology. Ecological civilization. That's what I want. That's what I'm in this game for. I mean, these alternative spiritual communities are growing. They're not very stable in my experience. Very like
For sure.
very embryonic, I would say. But there's a lot of hunger for it, and we need community. And there's a lot of loneliness right now. And so I think people are going to need community. Are going to keep seeking out, and even if not every community like holds together very well, um, these alternative spiritual communities definitely are growing. I mean, I see it all over the place, and we need it. And I think we're due for a reformation, frankly, along with a political revolution. I think that's the territory we're headed into. Um, just because everything is so unstable that it's not, the institutions aren't going to really hold. Our political, not just the United States, but like all over the Western world, our institutions aren't holding, and so it that inevitably ends up in like some kind of civil war, some kind of social conflict of different flavors in different spots, but conflict for sure.
Well, I'd like to make a prediction here that we're in a very eschatological moment here. A lot of people are expecting the end of the world because of the let's just say it's self-fulfilling prophecy that's happening in the Middle East, and these people
Yep.
are trying to create Armageddon. And when all this smoke blows over and people realize that the world is still here and is going to continue, that there will be this need to really take care of the earth in the sense of, because that eschatology what comes with it is that there is a life and an age to come and the earth passes away. And so there's no need to take care of it because God's going to recreate it and get rid of it.
Uh,
And the mother needs to be dealt, she's going to be done away with and reformed. And so it doesn't matter what we do to the earth. And that is a very strong doctrine, whether Christians want to admit it or not. That's why there's very much a lack of concern of, in my opinion, of in the Western world of not taking care of the earth because it's going to be done away with anyway. So maybe when this chaos blows over and this psychological psyop of centuries in the making blow over, maybe we can actually start to take this a little bit more seriously when people realize that that's not exactly how this is going to end.
Well, I agree with you. I do think we're in an eschatological moment, and a lot of people are creating self-fulfilling prophecies from the Book of Revelations, and nuclear weapons, and a third temple in the Middle East, and the Holy Land strikes me as awfully apocalyptic. Um, but I remember thinking about this as a kid. What does the end times really mean? Like the end of the universe? Like what do people expect is going to happen at the end time? Like the whole I literally, like, do you expect the universe to blow up, or what do people expect? I sort of came to the conclusion a long time ago that it's like it's the end of an era, and which means it'll be the beginning of a new era. And so, like, the end of one chapter automatically means the beginning of the next chapter. And so I try to focus on being what part of what comes next, and team what comes next, and team grass shoots for like, because right now though we got to survive the house burning down and the earthquake and ride out the storm before we can even get to like building something new. We got to survive the house fire first. And that's the house
No,
fire.
man, actually, I have to disagree that you have to wait for the house to burn down. I think the thing to do is to be creating, the new structures and systems, exploring, finding different resources and different ways of doing things, forming community, because that's how you're going to survive the house burning
I
down.
agree with you. I agree with you. I don't mean to like do nothing, sit on our hands, but I do mean like literally like the house. Like there's an immediate house fire. Like got to get out of the
Oh,
house.
the house is on fire.
Um, so
We don't need no water. Um, Now I'll tell you something that I found really interesting recently, just as far as, people like it seems like, whether it's that, you know, media and culture is doubling down more on like Christianity or like, the MAGAification of things. But I went shopping, which is something I don't really do, especially because where I live, there is no shopping. So I had to drive. And I noticed that some of the places, the stores that I went into had, like kind of country music and also like sort of more, not necessarily like gospel, but music talking about like God, like very Christianized
right.
music playing in the background. And I thought that I was like, whoa, what in the world? Like out in public, like it's nothing, when it should really maybe be like, cheesy elevator music or just whatever. And then I also noticed a friend of mine told me to watch a certain series on Paramount Plus, which I'm not crazy about that company, but I was like, okay, I'll go on and I'll get a subscription and watch a series. And, I only plan to have the subscription for a month because I'm not necessarily interested in their content. But when I was trying to go through their content to find something else to watch, it was it really caters to that sort of conservative MAGA, more like the rural folks. Like some of these things really they're like what they show as like, their programming clearly makes a distinction between like, the city slickers and the good, hardworking folks out in the rural areas. And I just think it's fascinating because it's so blatant, yet I don't know that everybody realizes or sees or understands just how blatant it really is. And as somebody that lives in a more sort of rural area, um, I'm in like this little teeny city within a rural area. It's it's not like that. It's just it's very interesting, but I'm just really noticing that more and more. And I wonder how much the spell will be broken once the lead instigator and sort of like head of that movement is gone. Cause I just see it playing out in some very interesting, insidious, subtle
I
ways.
think after Trump, they go full Christian. I think the right wing just goes full Christian. When Trump
Think
after,
they're all the psychophants are gonna try to destroy each other, and I think a lot of
but like
people
there's
are
just no other
going to
ideologies out there.
wake
And I'm
up
not
from
saying
a
to be good
fog.
Christians, but they will talk up Christianity and organize around Christianity, even if it's totally fake. But like, there's no other political ideology out there for them to go to, other than just like pure
That's
criminality. Uh,
that's true. They don't have anything else, do they?
no, and the left has nothing.
Well, they kind of messed up their Freemason stuff, so that's all they can really use. So,
Yeah, what does MAGA mean to an Australian, Nathan?
well, if you asked a couple of people, they wouldn't know, or they would think, they'd probably think of Charlie Kirk. But
Oh, really?
so a lot of Australians, they think like they don't really get into that sort of stuff. I guess more into our side of news in a sense. So a lot of Australians don't really
Mhm.
know much about America. All they see is conspiracy theories, I guess you could say.
And what do
But
they think of Trump?
it's mixed here. Some people like him, some people do not like him. Most people do not like him, so a lot of people give him shit in a sense. But to be fair, we don't like our own politicians. So, like, where you guys in America, you have large audiences watching the president. If that happened here, which has happened in the past, they throw eggs at politicians. And so we have a history of that, people getting arrested for throwing eggs, which is kind of weird. So it's kind of cool. But yeah, we really do not like politics. There is a couple of patriots here that were following a group that was basically a Trump ripoff. We had two actually Trump ripoffs. We had one that was One Nation. It's all no immigrants and rah, rah, immigration's bad, rah, rah, rah. And then we had another one that flunked, and he was saying, make Australia great again, full on ripping off Trump. No one gave a crap about him. He was just a rich billionaire, basically, or whatever. So most people just see Trump as sexist down here, to be honest. So I guess if you said May, they'll just think of America or Charlie Kirk because promoting it with his hat or whatever. So
Oh,
a lot of people here, I could say, it's sad to say, some people are smart, but there's a lot of undereducation, and our media here is very propaganda based, very propaganda based. Well, in America, you could speak openly a bit more about mocking government in a sense, and over here, you can do it, but it's more controlled. So, say if you're an independent person doing it, you might get a little bit, say, censored on YouTube wise. I try to avoid my politics here because we don't. The thing is, they don't like average people talking about politics. They want someone on the news screen talking about it, not the average person. So over here, they even had for a while. It's probably like that everywhere now. But our news had to turn off the dislike button because of all the dislike and hate they got. So, yeah.
interesting. Yeah, and your lockdowns were pretty severe too down there, weren't they?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
people rebel. We're a nation built upon by convicts in a sense, but even our police
Right.
force was made by the most behaved convicts. So it's like it's made to be dodgy from the start. So
Yeah.
it's like that everywhere. Every politics sucks. So I'm very anti-political in a sense. So I guess in some ways I'm anarchist, in some ways I'm not. So you know, I'm big for democracy made by the people, for the people, so ruled by the people, not any kings or anything like that. You know, to me,
Yeah.
my God's my king, and it's not of this world. It's spiritual, and it's also within you and me. And so, to me, I see God as the very fabrication of existence itself. So I see it as masculine and feminine. So I'm more interested in that than the worldly things. Whenever I focus on worldly things, I feel like I fail. It's yeah, our politics suck.
All right. Any final comments to wrap it up?
I just appreciate hearing those perspectives, Nathan. And so thank you for sharing that. And I love that Joshua asked that question. Thank you.
Well,
Sure.
thank you, both of you. All right. Well, I think we're gonna wrap it up. Next episode, we'll be back with Hezekiah and Reform Kings. And thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Nathan. And thank you, anyone that's listening. LostGoddess.io. Like and subscribe and all that stuff. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Good night.